Welcome to Cause Before Symptom, uncovering the real cabal and spiritual forces that are controlling the world. And now, here is your host, James Carter.
Welcome to Cause Before Symptom. I'm your host, James Carter. Today is May 25th, 2026. And tonight's episode is all about burning toward the future. Are disasters reshaping California on purpose? Well, California has become more than a state struggling with fires, blackouts, chemical spills, and collapsing infrastructure. It has become a testing ground for a larger question facing the modern world. When disaster strikes repeatedly in the same regions that are targeted for redevelopment, surveillance infrastructure, federal funding, and smart city expansion, is society simply adapting to crisis, or is crisis itself becoming part of the system? Well, this broadcast examines both sides of that question without blind trust or blind certainty. One side argues California's disasters are the predictable result of drought, aging utilities, overdevelopment, industrial concentration, poor governance, and environmental pressure. The other side sees a pattern that feels impossible to ignore. Land values collapse after catastrophe. Federal money floods in. Infrastructure is rebuilt with centralized technology. Insurers retreat. Ownership changes hands, and smart grid systems quietly emerge from the ashes. Now, history shows that disasters often reshape economies, accelerate political agendas, and transfer wealth upward. Well, the question is whether California is experiencing that transformation naturally, or whether powerful institutions have learned to profit from permanent instability. Well, tonight's investigation follows the money, the redevelopment maps, the federal aid structures, the insurance crisis, and the rise of digital infrastructure across disaster zones. It explores the uncomfortable space between negligence and coordination, between opportunism and intent. The goal is not to declare that every fire is engineered or every chemical spill is planned. The goal is to examine how modern systems increasingly survive through emergency, reconstruction, and crisis-driven transformation. Because, hey, whether the disasters are accidental, exploited, or something darker, the outcome may still be the same. A future rebuilt through fear, dependency, and centralized control. That's tonight's show. I'm looking forward to it. Shout out to everybody on the live chat Rumble. Number one warrior is Scorpion saying, hey guys, how's everyone? Pastor, I hoped you enjoyed your time away. Well, I went gold mining for a couple of days. I think I got about probably $100 to $180 worth of gold. I haven't cleaned it out and really weighed it yet, but usually when I go, I can get anywhere between 1 gram and 2 grams, somewhere between there, and sometimes even less. It just really depends, but I'm going up where the gold is, and we're just going to keep going where the source is, and who knows where it's going to be, but the labor that's involved is intense. It is intense because you're moving rocks, okay? Sometimes boulders, and the amount of rocks and dirt you suck up. And I'm doing it through a 3-inch hose, right? I'm sucking it up. But I bought this really cool nozzle that comes on top of the hose. It's a nozzle with the spray valve. You see, I used to have to take off the entire nozzle to use pressure washer to hose down all of the embankment, right? So that I can, but I have to put it back on, and it takes like 10 minutes. It's a pain in the ass. But this little nozzle goes, and it sprays water, and then I turn it off and then suck it. It really makes my day. It's a hell of a lot better than just the old way of just shoveling into buckets, which is a pain in the ass. And I also came across some mossy clay that was spread on top of the bedrock. Now, bedrock, I don't know if you know this, but bedrock is the layer of earth that gold just can't get through. So once you get to bedrock, that's where you're going to get your gold. And a lot of this gold that I've been finding is literally stuck in between the clay, moss, and the bed and underneath the bedrock, all the way up there. So sometimes I have to roll it off of the bottom and then shove it into a bucket. And then I take a drill with a paint stirrer, right? And I put water in the bucket and I just grind that mud, that clay, that moss, and all into a fine mixture. And that's one side of the process. Now, I could pour that into my sluice and continue on, but I like to just kind of pan that out, see what's in it. And usually that's what I find my biggest pieces is when I do that process. And yeah, I found some pretty nice. In fact, I found my first, well, maybe second picker, where you can literally, out of the pan, pick the gold and hold it. That's called a picker. But you can't pick it, even though it looks like you can. But the gold is kind of rounded, so the source is far away, because when gold travels down the rivers, it hits the rocks and it either breaks apart but it usually tumbles and it becomes more of a rounder object than it would straight from the source, would be kind of jagged. So it's upstream, and my claim is 10 acres, and I'm at the edge of the 10 acres, and well, the gold keeps going up, so we'll just follow it until I run out of juice, I guess. But it's really fun, and I enjoyed it. And thank you so much for asking about it, Scorpion. Number 2 warrior is Boots Hafner. The Boots, Sparkman, Spleefer, Powder Room, Kager guy himself, is sparking a spleefer in his garage and saying, from the Powder Room, hello, James and Warrior family. Today is a day to remember for those who paid the ultimate price, and I'm hoping everyone is remembering those who've fallen. Most of our close friends hit the thumbs up button, yes, and he also says to check out the formula of my award-winning detox formula, which is elitepotion.com. Yeah, well, let's first recognize it is Memorial Day. Thank you for helping me remember. Kind of like I just got back from the gold mine, so I'm a little doozy. But yeah, Memorial Day, I just want to say personally, thank you to all of those who fought for our country. Thank you for your service. God bless you. And if you could all do me a favor, we need a thumbs up for the show. If you can all do me a favor, follow my thumb down to my cell, right? Because I'm watching watching you guys live with me. Hit the X button if you can, and then hit the thumbs up, and then hit live chat. You won't lose your spot, I promise. And yes, don't forget elitepotion.com. Yeah, if you're having problems with getting into it, we've been changing over to a whole new website, a whole new payment plan, merchant account gateway. Anyway, if you have any problems, just email me, james@elitepotion.com, james@elitepotion.com. That is the product, parasites and heavy metals. Take that and you'll live longer, I promise. And that's it for everyone. We've got Boots and Scorpion here tonight. So let's get straight into shit breaking news.
Welcome to Shitty Breaking News with your host, James Carner, offering his shitty opinion.
The United States said it launched self-defense strikes in Iran as peace negotiations drag on. I think this thing is going to go on a lot longer than I thought. I thought it was going to be quick in and out, but, well, we're making money off of it, so we will see. 5 ways that Pope Leo says AI could warp humanity. I have to say I've heard a little bit of what Pope Leo was saying. Leo the Lion. I think he's right. He basically says we need to, what was the word? Restrain? I think it was restrain. I think we need to restrain AI. Stop it. It's dangerous. And I agree 100%. It's not only just dangerous for humanity and its future because it could take over, but also dangerous for jobs and creativity and for us to let AI do things for us when we don't do the thinking. It can think for us, and that's the real danger. And if we're not educated or grown up in, in a life, because I'm blessed to be a Generation Xer, and in between I grew up when there wasn't computers, and then they were introduced when I was a teenager. And that's where, I know what life was like with before it being in your household and then after. So I have that advantage. But those who are born in technology nowadays, who grew up with iPads, et cetera, well, they've been, letting the computers do the work for them. And that's a problem. And I'm really glad that Pope Leo sees this and says we need to restrain and refrain from using it because it's dangerous. I would agree with that. Ukraine war briefing. Russia pressures U.S. to clear way for attacks in Kyiv. Well, I say go for it. I'm not really a fan of any of these countries, Ukraine, Russia, America, China. I'm not a fan. But even though I'm an American citizen, I still have to support my country because that's just, embedded in me to support your country. But anything else outside the country, they're all warped. They're all liars. They're all out to get their own, and they're going to push you to the side to get it. And that's just how it's always been. That's leadership. So, how long is the Ukraine war going to go? I don't know. Maybe when Trump pulls out. Didn't sound right. When he pulls out of Iran, maybe it'll stop in Ukraine. I don't know, but we will see. Iran war live updates. Top Iranian negotiators arrive in Qatar for talks of peace. Sure. Well, we just obliterated one of their islands where they, I can't remember what's it called, Talk Island or something like that. I don't care. Anyway, it was one of their major oil reserve islands, and well, it's not functioning anymore. Benjamin Netanyahu, Bibi, says Israel will intensify strikes against Hezbollah. Of course, because Israel's most likely creating their own boogeyman. I don't trust Israel, and I don't think America should support Israel. And I really don't believe in AIPAC and that lobby and how most of people in Senate and Congress are supporting Israel. What are they doing for us? How come are they giving us money? No, we give them money and we support them, but they don't do shit for us. So I don't believe that there should be any quid pro quo with them. Well, there isn't. It's basically Israel telling America what to do. White House gunman had previous run-ins with Secret Service, court documents say. Yeah, he had previous run-ins, but he still was let loose to go shoot up the White House. Hey, welcome to the world that we live in. This is what we're going to be getting used to. Constant shit like this. It's never going to end. It's never going to stop. You guys are waiting for peace to come. Ain't going to happen. Why? Well, because all of these disasters create an economy. And that's what we're going to be talking about tonight, because it's a moneymaker, and it keeps people in fear, and it makes more money for the rich. Sorry. As Paul would say, have I become your enemy for telling you the truth? All right, when we come back tonight, we're going to be talking about California burning towards prosperity. We'll see.
Why do 75% of people feel exhausted all the time? The answer might surprise you. In the 1920s, Standard Oil decided to dive into medicine. They pushed synthetic petroleum into our drugs. Sure, it masked symptoms, but it wrecked our guts. Our good bacteria, which fight off parasites and heavy metals, got wiped out by crude oil. But here's the good news. We can fix this by going back to nature. Introducing Elite Potion, the world's top detox program. It restores your good bacteria by removing toxic threats like aluminum, strontium, barium, and parasites. Imagine feeling energized and alive again. They said there couldn't be a pill that did it all. We invented it. Visit elitepotion.com and reclaim your health from synthetic pharmaceuticals. Your body will thank you.
Paying federal income tax is voluntary. So why has every person you know done it their entire lives? You were told it's the law, but the system was built on a lie hidden in plain sight that you are required by law to pay. The truth is, 98% of Americans don't owe income tax by law. Federal income tax is for federal employees. For everyone else, it's voluntary. You agreed to pay when you signed your first tax return, and you've been renewing that contract every year since. Sounds too good to be true? You're asking, why doesn't everyone know this? Because almost everyone signed before they were old enough to understand it. It's time to unlearn the lie and break free from IRS jurisdictions, protect your assets, and keep more of what you earn legally. Visit unincorporatedassociations.com now and become tax-free.
All right, we're back. California is on fire. Chemicals are being blown up. Everyone's facing death. Well, welcome to Cause Before Symptom, where we do not chase the flames. We look for the hands, systems, failures, and incentives behind the smoke. And tonight's broadcast is not about panic, and it's not about pretending certainty where evidence does not exist. It is about asking difficult questions honestly in a world where trust is collapsing almost as fast as the infrastructure is around us. Well, California has become a symbol of modern instability. Fires consume entire neighborhoods, chemical spills poison communities, blackouts spread across regions that once represented technological progress. Insurance companies abandon homeowners, water systems strain under pressure. Federal emergency money floods into the state year after year, while redevelopment projects quietly rise from the ashes, stronger, smarter, and more connected, and more digitally controlled than ever before. Well, some people say this is simply the result of climate cycles, aging infrastructure, population growth, poor planning, and corporate negligence. Others believe the pattern goes much deeper, that disasters are no longer merely tragedies, but opportunities. Opportunities for land consolidation, opportunities for federal expansion, opportunities for surveillance infrastructure, opportunities for smart city systems that would have faced resistance if they had arrived during normal times instead of emergencies. Well, tonight, neither side gets a free pass because history teaches something uncomfortable. Crisis reshapes civilizations. Wars redraw borders. Financial collapse consolidate wealth. Terror attacks expand surveillance. Natural disasters rebuild cities according to entirely new plans. Emergencies create permission that governments, corporations, and institutions often cannot obtain during ordinary times. And fear lowers resistance. Chaos accelerates change. Reconstruction becomes transformation. Well, California now sits at the crossroads of all these pressures at once. It is one of the wealthiest regions on earth while simultaneously carrying enormous debt obligations, pension liabilities, housing instability, insurance collapse, energy transition costs, and infrastructure decay. It is home to Silicon Valley, AI development, data infrastructure, and some of the most advanced surveillance and logistics technologies in existence. It's also one of the most disaster-prone regions in America. Unsafe. Fires, earthquakes, droughts, floods, industrial accidents, and chemical hazards all overlap in the same economic machine. And that overlap, well, it creates suspicion. Because the same regions repeatedly struck by disaster are often the same regions targeted for redevelopment, smart grid expansion, sensor networks, electrified transportation systems, AI-managed infrastructure, and federally funded resilience projects. Wow, how convenient. After rebuilding comes modernization. After modernization comes dependency on centralized systems that monitor, regulate, and manage daily life more deeply than before. Well, does that prove coordination? No. But does it create incentives? Oh, you bet your ass. And incentives matter because systems under financial pressure often behave differently than stable systems. California's budget strain is real. I think it's 200 billion. Federal dependence is real. Insurance instability is real. Infrastructure decay is real. The cost of rebuilding modern civilization is becoming almost impossible to sustain without emergency funding, federal partnerships, and massive reconstruction cycles. Well, that reality alone can create a dangerous environment where institutions become dependent, not necessarily on causing disasters, but on using them once they happen. Well, that distinction matters tonight because there is a difference between proving intentional destruction and examining whether powerful systems have learned to benefit from permanent instability. Now, there is a difference between conspiracy and opportunism. There is a difference between engineered catastrophe and managed exploitation. And somewhere in that gray area lies the real modern question. Has crisis itself become part of the economic model? Well, think about it carefully. Fires destroy communities. Property values collapse. Residents without insurance cannot rebuild. Investors move in. Federal money arrives. Hot diggity damn. And infrastructure is replaced. Smart technologies are installed. Environmental regulations tighten. Utilities modernize. Governments expand oversight. Data systems grow. AI infrastructure spreads. The region emerges transformed, whether the original disaster was accidental, negligent, or exploited afterward. Well, the end result still reshapes society. That is why tonight's broadcast matters, because modern civilization increasingly runs on emergency. Financial systems survive through stimulus. Government survive through debt. Infrastructure survives through reconstruction. Technology expands through fear and dependency. And the public is often too exhausted from surviving the crisis itself to ask what kind of world is being built during the recovery. Well, tonight we're going to follow the money. Money. The land transfers, the federal aid, the redevelopment plans, the insurance collapse, and the rise of smart infrastructure throughout California's disaster zones. We are going to examine the official explanations and the darker suspicions side by side. Not to inflame fear, okay? Chill out. Not to force conclusions. We could be wrong. But to understand the structure that is quietly emerging around us. Because whether these disasters are accidental, exploited, or something more coordinated, one truth remains unavoidable. Every major crisis leaves behind a different California than the one that existed before the fire began. Well, it's the perfect storm. Now, California did not become unstable overnight. The conditions that now produce mega fires, infrastructure failures, chemical risks, insurance collapse, and redevelopment battles were building for, decades. The state sits on a fault line, not only geographically, but economically, politically, environmentally, and technologically. Oh, boy. Not only on San Andreas Fault, it's the beauty of the Natalie, what was her name? I hated that song anyway. It is one of the most advanced regions on Earth, while simultaneously becoming one of the most fragile. It's safer to live anywhere but California. Now, to understand why California keeps appearing at the center of modern disaster narratives, it's important to understand the scale of what exists there. California is not merely another American state. It is its own country. It would rank among the largest economies in the world. It contains massive agricultural systems, global shipping ports, AI development centers, military infrastructure, financial networks, energy corridors, rail systems, technology headquarters, entertainment industries, and some of the most densely populated urban regions in North America. Well, the modern digital economy itself is deeply tied to California through Silicon Valley, cloud infrastructure, logistics systems, and data architecture. But concentrated power also creates concentrated vulnerability. The same state that built the future now struggles to maintain the systems it already has. Electrical grids stretch across dry forests filled with decades of overgrown vegetation. Oops. Water systems strain under drought pressure while millions continue moving into high-risk zones. Oops. Chemical transport routes run through densely populated urban areas. Oops. Ports move enormous volumes of hazardous materials every day. Oops. Rail systems carry toxic industrial compounds across the state. Oops. Aging pipelines, battery storage facilities, refineries, and electrical infrastructure, well, they all sit inside regions increasingly vulnerable to heat, wind, and fire. And when one system fails, another often falls and fails with it. A wildfire is no longer just a wildfire. It can trigger blackouts, chemical contamination, evacuations, insurance collapse, supply chain disruption, toxic smoke exposure coming soon, housing shortages, infrastructure damage, and economic displacement simultaneously. Well, modern disasters cascade because modern civilization itself has become interconnected. The more technologically advanced society becomes, the more systems depend on each other after remaining stable at all times. Well, California also faces another problem that receives far less attention: the collision between natural geography and modern expansion. Much of the land now covered in suburbs and infrastructure was historically fire-adapted terrain. Forests and grasslands were meant to burn periodically. Indigenous land management once reduced fuel accumulation through controlled burns and careful stewardship. But modern development expanded deep into the wildland-urban interface, while decades of aggressive fire suppression allowed vegetation to build into enormous fuel reserves. Add drought, heat waves, seasonal winds, and aging utility infrastructure, and the result becomes explosive. Well, at the same time, California's political and economic pressures intensified. Housing costs surged, insurance companies began retreating from fire-prone regions, pension liabilities grew, infrastructure repair costs climbed into the hundreds of billions, water politics became increasingly unstable, energy transition goals required massive modernization efforts, and meanwhile, the state remained heavily dependent on federal cooperation during major emergencies. How convenient. Well, this is where the distrust begins to grow. Because as disasters become larger, so do the rebuilding programs that followed them. Entire regions are no longer simply repaired, they are redesigned. Electrical grids become smart grids, roads become sensor-integrated transportation corridors, soon teleportation. Utilities become digitally monitored. Emergency systems become centralized through AI-managed networks. Housing redevelopment introduces higher density planning and stricter environmental compliance standards. Communications infrastructure expands and data systems spread deeper into everyday life. Well, to some, this is simply modernization. To others, it feels like transformation through crisis. And that suspicion grows stronger because California now sits at the center of several powerful industries all at once: artificial intelligence, surveillance technology, energy transition infrastructure, logistics automation, cloud computing, and data management systems. Well, the same state repeatedly hit by disasters is also the same state leading the development of technologies designed to monitor, predict, and manage human behavior, transportation, utilities, environmental conditions, and resource consumption. Well, that overlap does not prove conspiracy, but it does create an uncomfortable convergence of incentives. Because disaster recovery has become an economy all on its own. Federal funding flows into damaged regions. Reconstruction contracts multiply. Hey, where's that smart rail? Did they have like this $6 billion? They got all the money and then they haven't even broke ground to build this fast rail between LA and San Francisco? Sure. Infrastructure projects accelerate. Contracts multiply, insurance money moves through financial systems, land changes hands, investors acquire distressed property, governments gain authority to implement new standards and planning models that might otherwise face public resistance during normal times. Well, history shows that societies often change fastest during periods of fear and instability. Emergencies create urgency. Urgency lowers resistance. And California now exists in a near permanent state of managed emergency, moving from wildfire season to drought season to blackout warnings to infrastructure crisis, almost without a pause. Well, that reality alone is enough to create two competing explanations. Well, one explanation says California is simply experiencing an unavoidable consequence of overdevelopment, environmental pressure, aging infrastructure, and modern industrial complexity. In this view, disasters are tragic but natural outcomes of a strained system trying to survive impossible demands. While the other explanation says the pattern is too useful to too many powerful institutions to ignore. Even if disasters are not directly orchestrated, crisis repeatedly creates opportunities for redevelopment, federal expansion, technological integration, and economic consolidation that permanently reshape society afterward. Robert Gerterson is back saying, hey, y'all, great to be back from a 3-day canoe trip below the Hoover Dam. Wow, surprised there was any water. Tonight's investigation begins in that tension, folks. The tension where Robert Gerterson was canoeing in a place where there's no water. Because before asking whether California is being intentionally transformed, we first have to understand why it became so vulnerable to transformation in the first place. Well, let's talk about the wildfire economy. There was a time when a wildfire was viewed primarily as a natural disaster. A lightning would strike, igniting dry land, firefighters responded, forests burned, and communities were then rebuilt. But modern California fires no longer behave like isolated natural events. They have evolved into economic engines that move enormous amounts of money, reshape land ownership, transform infrastructure, and alter entire regions long after the flames disappear. Well, the scale alone is difficult to comprehend. A single major California fire season can generate tens of billions of dollars in total economic damage. Where's all that money going? Homes vanish in hours. Businesses collapse. Utility infrastructure melts. Roads, bridges, communication towers, and water systems require replacement. Insurance claims surge into historic territory. Federal emergency declarations unlock massive aid packages. Contractors flood into disaster zones. Environmental cleanup begins. Debris removal becomes an industry of its own. Debris. Lawyers, engineers, consultants, utility companies, insurers, developers, and government agencies all enter the recovery cycle simultaneously. Man, it sounds like it's really, really important that a fire happens, especially chemical. And that's where the idea of the wildfire economy begins. Because while fires destroy communities, they also generate extraordinarily amounts of financial money in a movement. Now, reconstruction itself becomes a market. Entire sectors now depend on perpetual rebuilding cycles. Construction firms, utility modernization projects, emergency management contracts, environmental remediation companies, infrastructure consultants, and technology providers all expand during recovery periods. Now, this does not mean fires are intentionally created. But it does mean modern disasters response has become deeply integrated into economic systems. Take the insurance industry as an example. Now, California's repeated megafires have pushed insurers into crisis mode. Companies increasingly refuse to cover high-risk regions or dramatically raise premiums. Entire communities now face the possibility of becoming effectively uninsurable. For ordinary homeowners, this creates devastating pressure. Many cannot afford to rebuild. Others leave permanently after losing coverage. But distressed regions often attract investors with larger pools of capital capable of absorbing risk over longer periods. How convenient. Well, that changes ownership patterns. And after disasters, land that once belonged to families can quietly move into the hands of developers, investment groups, corporate buyers, etc. Well, neighborhoods rebuild differently than before. Zoning changes occur, density increases, infrastructure standards evolve, smart utilities and sensor systems are introduced during reconstruction. Now, roads and evacuation systems are also redesigned. Power grids become more centralized and digitally monitored. And the fire does not merely destroy a community, it creates the conditions for transformation. Well, this pattern is not unique to California. History repeatedly shows that disaster accelerates redevelopment. Fires rebuilt Chicago. Earthquakes transformed San Francisco. Hurricanes reshaped New Orleans. War reconstructed Europe. Crisis creates opportunities to redesign systems in ways that would have taken decades during stable times. Well, what makes California different is frequency here. The state no longer experiences occasional catastrophic events. It experiences recurring emergency cycles. Fire season itself has expanded dramatically. Entire regions now live under constant evacuation warnings, smoke alerts, utility shutoffs, and insurance instability. Communities exist in a permanent state of anticipation, never fully recovering before the next emergency begins. Well, that constant instability creates dependency on federal and institutional support systems. When a major fire strikes, federal disaster declarations can unlock billions through FEMA assistance, infrastructure repair programs, environmental cleanup grants, hazard mitigation funding, housing aid, and emergency recovery packages. Now that shit goes to you. Utilities seek federal partnerships for grid hardening and underground power line projects. Local governments apply for redevelopment assistance. Emergency spending bypasses normal timelines because the urgency of disaster creates political pressure for rapid action. And this is where suspicion begins growing among critics of the system, especially this critic, because many of the same regions devastated by fires later became testing grounds for resilient infrastructure or smart redevelopment and digitally integrated planning systems. How convenient. New building codes appear, environmental compliance standards tighten, electrification expands, sensor networks grow, AI-assisted monitoring systems emerge, emergency communication infrastructure becomes centralized, smart grid technology spread into communities rebuilt after catastrophe. Well, to suppliers, this is practical modernization. Why rebuild old vulnerable systems when newer technology exists? Well, to critics, however, the pattern looks extremely different. They see disasters repeatedly clearing the path for centralized infrastructure that might otherwise have faced public resistance. They see ordinary homeowners financially crushed while institutional capital grows stronger. They see federal funding attached to long-term redevelopment agendas already planned before the fires occurred. Again, none of this proves intention or causation. But incentives matter because systems under stress adapt according to survival needs. California's wildfire crisis now intersects with housing shortages, insurance collapse, energy modernization, federal funding dependence, and smart infrastructure expansion all at the same time. Well, that convergence alone creates a powerful economic momentum around reconstruction. And there's another layer that most people never consider. Modern fires themselves are becoming chemically different. Homes today are filled with plastics, lithium batteries, electronics, synthetic insulation, treated materials, and industrial compounds. When neighborhoods burn, they release toxic smoke and hazardous debris far beyond what historical wildfires produce. Entire regions can become environmental cleanup zones requiring specialized remediation and long-term health monitoring. Well, in other words, the modern wildfire is no longer just a fire. It is an environmental event, a housing crisis, an insurance crisis, an infrastructure crisis, a public health crisis, a federal funding event, and a redevelopment opportunity all at once. And when enough money, technology, politics, and land transformation converge around recurring emergencies, the line between recovery and restructuring becomes increasingly difficult to separate. Well, that leads us to chemical disasters, and infrastructure collapse. When most people think about disasters in California, they picture hillsides on fire and neighborhoods buried in smoke. But another threat moves quietly beneath the surface of modern life: chemical infrastructure. We're talking about pipelines, rail systems, battery storage facilities, ports, refineries, industrial corridors, and hazardous material transport routes. Well, they all form a hidden network running underneath the state's economy. Most citizens rarely notice it until something explodes, leaks, ignites, or contaminates an entire community. Weren't we warned about it by the movie White Noise? And that is what makes chemical disasters different from wildfires. A wildfire is visible. A chemical disaster is often invisible until the damage is already spread through the air, water, soil, or human body. Toxic smoke drifts for miles. Groundwater absorbs industrial runoff. Battery fires release hazardous gases. Rail spills contaminate communities. Aging pipelines rupture beneath neighborhoods, and refineries ignite near population centers. And because California's economy is built around logistics, energy, manufacturing, and technology, enormous amounts of hazardous material move through that state every single day. Well, the modern industrial world depends on chemicals most people never think about. Ports receive solvents, fuels, industrial acids, fertilizers, lithium compounds, compressed gases, and petroleum products from all around the world. Freight trains transport hazardous cargo directly through cities and suburbs. Warehouses store industrial batteries and energy systems of unprecedented scale. Refineries process massive volumes of fuel near densely populated regions. Data centers and energy transition infrastructure increasingly rely on battery storage systems that introduce entirely new fire behaviors emergency crews are still learning to manage. Something new. We got to create something new to blow up. And unlike older industrial eras, modern chemical risk is deeply connected to digital infrastructure. You see, California's push toward electrification and renewable energy has dramatically increased dependence on lithium-ion battery systems, solar storage facilities, EV charging networks, and grid-scale energy storage sites. Supporters view this as necessary modernization, while critics warn that this infrastructure is expanding way faster than long-term safety systems and emergency responses are capable of, managing. Battery fires especially become a growing concern because they behave differently than traditional fires. Once thermal runaway begins inside a lithium system, fires can reignite repeatedly while releasing toxic gases and intense heat. Firefighters often cannot extinguish them using normal methods. And in some cases, damaged batteries burn for days. As California expands energy storage infrastructure, the risk profile of entire regions changes along with it. Then there's the issue with the aging infrastructure. California's industrial backbone was not built for the pressure now placed upon it. Many pipelines, electrical systems, rail corridors, water networks, and industrial facilities were constructed decades ago under completely different population and climate conditions. Deferred maintenance, financial strain, regulatory battles, and sheer scale create vulnerabilities everywhere, for terrorists. And when systems fall, the consequences can cascade rapidly. A refinery fire does not merely damage a facility, it can affect fuel supply, public health, and local employment, environmental systems, transportation, logistics, and emergency services simultaneously. Where is Aaron Brockovich? A rail derailment carrying hazardous chemicals can contaminate entire waterways. A battery storage explosion can trigger evacuation zones and air quality emergencies. A pipeline rupture can ignite neighborhoods in seconds. Modern civilization has concentrated enormous energy and chemical density into urban environments while simultaneously becoming more dependent on uninterrupted technological stability. Well, that dependence creates fear because chemical disasters often unlock immediate federal involvement. Well, we don't have enough to pay our people, so we're going to do something about that. Anything near us we can blow up? Unlike slow-moving financial problems or budget debates, hazardous material emergencies demand rapid response and fast money. Federal agencies arrive quickly. Environmental Protection Agency investigation begins. FEMA resources activate. Never looking for the cause, just, investigating these symptoms. Public health agencies intervene poorly. Emergency cleanup contracts are issued. Hazard mitigation funds become available. Infrastructure replacement projects, they accelerate. And because chemical disasters are viewed as immediate threats to human safety, political resistance to emergency funding becomes far weaker. Well, critics of the system notice this pattern closely. Critics like me, they see that the major chemical events can trigger rapid federal money fast. Fast. Environmental authority expansion, forced evacuations, redevelopment projects, and infrastructure modernization programs almost overnight. Well, now we can pay our bills. Well, to them, this creates dangerous incentives inside systems already under financial stress. And again, evidence does matter. There is a major difference between proving intentional sabotage and examining how institutions respond once disaster occurs. But history does show that industrial crisis often becomes catalyst for political and economic transformation. Well, after toxic events, governments frequently implement new monitoring systems, expanded environmental regulations, smart grid upgrades, sensor networks, centralized emergency communication, and digitally integrated oversight systems. Well, in California, these changes increasingly overlap with the broader rise of smart infrastructure and AI-managed urban planning. At the same time, ordinary citizens often feel trapped because two competing realities are here. On one side, officials promise modernization, sustainability, and resilience. On the other, people watch their insurance disappear, utility costs rise, surveillance systems expand, and communities become more dependent on centralized technological systems after every major emergency. Well, this is where the distrust deepens. Because modern chemical disasters expose something larger than industrial failure. They reveal how fragile technologically dependent societies have become. A single spill, explosion, or infrastructure collapse can ripple through housing, transportation, communications, energy, healthcare, and economics simultaneously. Well, the public begins realizing that civilization itself now operates like a tightly connected machine where one damaged component can destabilize entire regions. California may simply be the first state where that reality is becoming impossible to hide. They're all fucking crooks. Well, the question is whether leaders are merely trying to manage a dangerously complex system, or whether crisis itself has quietly become the mechanism through which the next version of society is being built. I think it's the latter. Well, the phrase smart city sounds harmless at first. To some people, it means cleaner transportation, efficient traffic flow, energy conservation, safer infrastructure, and faster emergency response systems. Build this so we won't burn your house down later. Cities equipped with sensors, AI-managed utilities, connected transportation systems, and real-time environmental monitoring promise a future where technology helps solves the growing pressures of modern urban life. But critics hear something different. They hear centralized management, constant data collection, digital dependency, automated enforcement systems, AI-driven governance, infrastructure capability of monitoring movement, energy use, transportation patterns, communication systems, and behavior in real time. And when those systems appear most aggressively after disasters, suspicion grows quickly. Well, California now sits directly in the middle of this debate. We're in the middle, but trust us. After major fires, blackouts, droughts, and infrastructure failures, rebuilding plans increasingly include resilience technologies. Electrical grids become smarter and more interconnected. Traffic systems become sensor-based. Water systems gain digital monitoring. Emergency communications become AI-assisted. Utilities install smart meters capable of real-time usage tracking. Environmental sensors spread across urban corridors. And surveillance cameras integrate with automated license plate readers and predictive policing software and facial recognition. Public transportation systems become digitally managed ecosystems connected to centralized data infrastructure. Well, supporters argue that this is simply what modern infrastructure looks like. Well, critics argue it's something else entirely. A slow transition from open civic life into algorithmically managed society. Something like Technocracy Inc. wants. And what makes the debate more uncomfortable is that many of these systems generally do provide benefits. They do. Smart traffic systems can reduce congestion. Hey, sensor-based fire detection can identify danger zones faster. AI-managed utilities can balance energy demand during emergencies. Real-time environmental monitoring can warn communities about toxic air or contaminated water. Well, during disasters, centralized communication systems can save lives. Well, that is why expansion happens so easily after catastrophe, because emergency conditions create urgency. People frightened by fires, blackouts, evacuations, and chemical threats become far more willing to accept technologies promising stability and protection. Well, the systems arrive not through force, but through necessity. As every crisis strengthens the argument that more monitoring, more automation, more centralized coordination are required to prevent the next disaster. All the people who own the homes in those areas, well, they have to lose their home and not gain a new home for us to be better equipped to not let that happen again. And this is where California becomes significant. The same state repeatedly struck by emergencies is also home to the industries building the technologies designed to manage those emergencies. Silicon Valley companies develop AI systems, sensor networks, cloud infrastructure, predictive analytics, autonomous logistics, surveillance software, and data management architecture that increasingly shape modern governance itself. In other words, California is not merely rebuilding after disaster. It's rebuilding through the very technologies its own economies engine produces. Well, that overlap creates a feedback loop. Disasters justify modernization. Modernization expands digital infrastructure. Digital infrastructure creates deeper dependence on centralized systems. And deeper dependence increases the role of institutions capable of managing those systems. Well, this is especially visible in energy infrastructure. California, their push towards renewable energy and electrification requires massive change to the electrical grid. Smart meters, remote energy management systems, battery storage facilities, and AI-assisted load balancing are all becoming necessary to stabilize increasingly complex energy demands. Well, during heat waves or wildfire threats, utilities can often remotely influence power distribution across regions. Now, supporters view this as survival in a strained energy environment. Critics see this early framework of programmable infrastructure capable of controlling daily life through energy access itself. Meaning, you've had enough showers today. One's done. Then there's transportation. Modern smart city planning increasingly revolves around integrated transportation ecosystems. EV charging networks, traffic sensors, autonomous vehicle preparation, license plate traffic systems, smart tolling, AI-managed traffic flow, and digital public transit coordination. Well, all these systems generate enormous amounts of behavioral data, while also creating the infrastructure for centralized management of movement through urban environments. And they need a place to store all this info. They need data centers that suck up water. Again, none of this is any secret. Most of it is openly promoted as efficiency, sustainability, and resilience planning. Well, the real tension is philosophical. At one point, does a city stop serving human freedom and begin managing human behavior? Well, because smart city infrastructure is not merely about technology, it's about governance through systems. The more connected infrastructure becomes, the more authority shifts away from individuals and toward the institutions controlling the networks themselves. And disasters, well, they accelerate that transition because rebuilding creates opportunities that stable conditions just simply do not. Entire regions damaged by fire or infrastructure collapse can be reconstructed according to entirely new technological standards. Roads, utilities, communications, housing, density, environmental monitoring, and transportation systems can all be redesigned simultaneously under the justification of resilience and safety. To many systems, this feels less like recovery and more like replacement, especially when combined with economic pressure. As insurance disappears and rebuilding costs rise, ordinary homeowners struggle to remain in disaster-prone regions. Meanwhile, governments, developers, technology firms, and institutional investors, they all possess the capital necessary to shape the next version of these communities. Well, the result is a growing fear that California is slowly evolving into a model where crisis clears the path for digitally integrated urban systems controlled increasingly from the top down. Now, to be fair, there is another side to this. California's leaders are facing genuine problems. Fires are getting larger, infrastructure is aging, water systems are strained, population density complicates emergency response, energy demands continue growing, climate pressure, whether natural or human driven, is creating instability across multiple systems simultaneously. Now, from that perspective, smart infrastructure may not represent authoritarian ambition at all, but rather desperate adaptation to a civilization becoming too complex to manage manually. But they ever go in that direction like that? No, that's not what they do. They want to steal, kill, and destroy. And perhaps that is what makes the moment so difficult to interpret. Because the same system that can increase safety can also increase control. Kind of like with the passing of the digital Bitcoin crap. Yeah, I don't know if you guys know this, but they got further ahead with the, the Clarity Act. Well, what that means is coins are going to be centralized, meaning controlled. And the whole point of making Bitcoin and all those other coins, those other stable coins, all that other shit, was that so they weren't centralized, controlled by who? Bakers. Because the same systems that can increase safety can also increase control. And the same technology that improves efficiency can also eliminate privacy. Wow. The same infrastructure that stabilizes society during crisis can also centralize authority permanently afterward. How convenient. California may not fully realize the smart state experiment just yet, but it is undeniably becoming a place where disaster, technology, governance, and surveillance increasingly rise together from the same ashes. Now, every civilization eventually reaches a moment where the cost of maintaining itself becomes almost impossible to sustain. Roads decay faster than they can be repaired. You can tell when you're driving through a blue state. Then you get to a red state. Then the blue state. I'm just saying, I've been driving across country quite a many times, and that's my experience. I'm not blaming anybody. I'm just saying where their priorities go. Infrastructure ages beyond its intended lifespan, and pension systems grow heavier. Insurance systems weaken, energy demands rise, emergency response costs multiply. Governments borrow to survive today, while promising future growth will somehow solve tomorrow's obligations. Well, we could just, pay all this money over here from this lawsuit about us fucking up, or put that money into the roads. I'll tell you, have you ever driven in Flagstaff on any highway? God help you. California now stands dangerously close to that threshold. The state remains one of the richest economic regions on earth. I don't know how. Technology giants generate unimaginable wealth there. Global shipping flows through its ports. Agriculture feeds enormous portions of the country. Venture capital, entertainment, AI development, logistics, and digital infrastructure all thrive inside California's economic machine. Yet despite this wealth, the state faces immense long-term pressure from debt obligations, infrastructure costs, pension liabilities, housing shortages, insurance instability, and reoccurring disasters. Boot says, and California is still listening to the globalist terrorists. It's a lie. Buy in. Mind blown. This contradiction confuses many Americans, folks. How can one of the wealthiest places on earth appear perpetually strained? Because wealth generation and financial stability are not the same thing. California produces enormous amounts of money, but it also consumes enormous amounts of money simply trying to maintain the system already in place. Infrastructure modernization alone requires staggering investment. Water systems, electrical grids, wildfire mitigation, transportation corridors, environmental compliance programs, and housing expansion all demand continuous funding. Then disasters arrive on top of those existing obligations. And that is where federal power enters the equation. Because modern states increasingly depend on Washington during major emergencies because disaster recovery costs have grown beyond what many local governments can absorb independently. Wildfires, floods, blackouts, infrastructure failures, chemical contamination, and housing crisis now trigger federal disaster declarations that unlock billions in aid, reimbursements, hazard mitigation grants, infrastructure funding, and emergency assistance programs, tax-free. In California, this dependence has become deeply structural. Yeah. Federal partnership now touches nearly every major crisis response system in the state through wildfire recovery, water infrastructure, transportation modernization, environmental cleanup, energy resilience, housing assistance, and public health response. Without federal involvement, recovery timelines would slow dramatically and financial pressure on local governments would intensify almost immediately. That's why the federal government goes, "You assholes started another fucking fire?" Damn it, cut him a check. But dependency changes power relationships because money rarely arrives without conditions attached. Federal funding often comes tied to environmental mandates, rebuilding standards, infrastructure requirements, regulatory compliance, reporting systems, and long-term planning frameworks. Fuck it, we could use AI to do all that shit. As long as they have a planning framework using AI. And during stable periods, states may resist federal influence. During emergencies, however, survival itself can require cooperation, and that creates an actual dangerous cycle. This is what we're witnessing in California. So the more financially strained a system becomes, the more vulnerable it becomes to governance through funding. Disaster aid begins functioning not only as recovery assistance, but also as leverage shaping how regions often rebuild afterward. This is one of the reasons that critics of centralized power watch California so closely. They see the state trapped between financial instability, repeated disasters, and increasing dependence on federal partnerships tied to modernization agendas. Well, to them, emergencies no longer appear temporary. They appear structural. The system itself now survives through perpetual reconstruction cycles. And there is evidence supporting at least part of that concern. Wow, there is? California's budget problems are real, but pension obligations continue growing. Infrastructure repair backlogs remain enormous. Insurance companies are retreating from high-risk regions, and utilities face billions in wildfire liabilities and grid hardening costs. Water politics remain unstable. Housing affordability has reached crisis levels. And at the same time, the state continues pursuing some of the most ambitious energy transition and infrastructure modernization programs in America. All that requires money, folks. Massive amounts of money. And disasters often unlock that faster than ordinary politics ever could. Chemical fire, perfect timing for California. Think about how governments behave during normal conditions. Infrastructure projects can remain stalled for years in environmental reviews, funding battles, and political negotiations. But after a catastrophe, urgency changes everything. We got to save the people. Emergency declarations bypass delays. Federal money accelerates. Large-scale projects suddenly become politically unavoidable. It's pretty fucking obvious. A destroyed electrical system becomes justification for smart grid expansion. A wildfire zone becomes justification for underground utilities and sensor networks. A chemical spill becomes justification for environmental monitoring systems. A blackout becomes justification for centralized energy management. Each crisis strengthens the argument that modernization can no longer wait. Now, none of this proves intentional orchestration. That distinction matters a little. But systems under stress often evolve toward dependency on emergencies because emergencies unlock resources that stable periods do not. And this pattern extends beyond California. Modern America itself increasingly survives through crisis spending, financial bailouts, pandemic stimulus, war appropriations, disaster declarations, infrastructure packaging, and emergency monetary intervention. Well, instead of allowing painful resets, systems postpone collapse through temporary stabilization mechanism. Debt expands, reconstruction continues, emergency funding fills gaps that ordinary budgeting cannot sustain. Well, the public moves from one crisis to the next without fully resolving the structural weaknesses underneath it. Now, California simply exposes this dynamic more visibly than most places because the scale is so enormous and the disasters occur so frequently. It's kind of like a little blueprint for all the other states. If you're running out of money, blow shit up. And this is where the debate becomes uncomfortable. On one side, argues federal disaster funding represents compassion, cooperation, and necessary national support during emergencies. And in that view, modern crisis simply requires coordinated response beyond the capability of individual states. On the other side, sees a gradual transition toward dependency-based governance where financial survival increasingly requires alignment with centralized systems, regulations, and technological frameworks tied to federal power. Well, perhaps both are true at the same time, because the deeper issue may not be whether disasters are intentionally created. The deeper issue may be, whether modern civilization has become financially incapable of sustaining itself without perpetual emergency, perpetual reconstruction, and perpetual dependence on larger systems of centralized authority. There, I said it. So if tonight's discussion stopped at California alone, many people could dismiss the entire pattern as coincidence. But history repeatedly shows that crisis often becomes opportunities for restructuring economies, consolidating power, and accelerating systems that would have faced resistance during stable periods. Now, this does not automatically prove every disaster is engineered. It is. It proves something far more subtle and perhaps more dangerous, that institutions frequently adapt to catastrophe faster than ordinary people do. And those with capital often emerge stronger after collapse. Well, that pattern is ancient as the Stone Age. Major fires have rebuilt cities according to entirely new designs. Wars have redrawn borders and concentrated wealth. Financial crashes have transferred ownership from smallholders to large institutions. Natural disasters have transformed land use, surveillance policy, infrastructure planning, and political authority. Again and again and again and again, moments of instability become gateways for permanent change. Now, one of the clearest modern examples came after the attacks of September 11, 2001. Before 9/11, mass digital surveillance faced far more public resistance. After the attacks, emergency powers expanded rapidly, intelligence agencies gained new authority, data collection increased dramatically, airport security transformed permanently, where they got to check out your balls and your wee-wee just to get through line. Airport security transformed permanently, and surveillance systems, once considered extreme, now became normalized because, hey, fear created urgency. How convenient. New Orleans suffered catastrophic destruction. Remember that? Well, it took FEMA, 2 weeks to get there? But critics later argued that the recovery process fundamentally changed the city itself. Public housing shifted, education system transformed, redevelopment accelerated in ways that permanently altered who could afford to live there. Large investors and developers possessed the capital to rebuild, while many ordinary residents struggled to return. Now, whether intentional or opportunistic, the disaster reshaped ownership and governance patterns for years afterward. And financial collapses show similar behavior. During the 2008 housing crisis, millions lost homes while institutional investors gained access to distressed assets at historical scale. Hands up, balls out, says Scorpion. That is true. Hands up, balls out. Banks received bailouts while ordinary citizens absorbed economic pain. Entire neighborhoods shifted toward corporate ownership, and once again, crisis accelerated consolidation. Now, this is why the phrase disaster capitalism emerged in political discussion, because it's a real thing. The idea, though, it's not necessarily that elites create every crisis, but the crisis is that modern systems increasingly use instability to push through changes that benefit large institutions economically or politically. So fear lowers resistance, emergency suspends normal debate, and reconstruction creates opportunity. Well, California now appears to many critics as the next evolution of that model. Hey, hail, hail, democracy. Repeated disasters generate federal money, redevelopment contracts, infrastructure modernization, environmental regulation expansion, smart grid implementation, and changing ownership patterns all at once. Every major fire or infrastructure failure creates another opening for transformative and transformation. And whether accidental or exploited afterward, the end result often moves society toward more centralized systems than existed before the crisis. How convenient. And perhaps the most important thing history teaches is that populations rarely surrender freedom during calm periods. Major changes usually arrive through instability. Wars justify emergency authority. Economic crashes justify central banking intervention. Terror attacks justify surveillance expansion. Public health emergencies justify movement restriction. And environmental crises justify infrastructure centralization. Guys, every age has its own mechanism, and it's all freaking fraud. Well, tonight's question is not whether climate disasters, infrastructure collapse, and chemical emergencies are becoming the mechanism of this era. And to be fair, many leaders genuinely believe centralized coordination is necessary. Modern civilization has become extraordinarily complex. Electrical grids, water systems, transportation corridors, data infrastructure, energy networks, and supply chains now operate like interconnected organs inside a single machine. One failure can destabilize entire regions, and from that perspective, governments are not plotting domination, they are trying desperately to prevent collapse. But critics argue something else is happening simultaneously. They argue modern institutions no longer merely respond to crisis. They increasingly require crisis to sustain political momentum, funding flows, technological expansion, and economic restructuring. Well, in other words, emergencies have become productive. That is a disturbing concept because, hey, it changes how people interpret disaster itself. A fire is no longer only a tragedy, it becomes a redevelopment. A blackout becomes modernization. A chemical spill becomes infrastructure funding. A housing collapse becomes a resonating opportunity. An emergency becomes leverage. And once systems discover that crisis accelerates transformation faster than stability ever could, public trust begins to erode rapidly. This is where California's situation becomes especially symbolic. The state sits at the intersection of nearly every modern pressure point at once. AI infrastructure, energy transition, housing instability, insurance collapse, federal dependency, surveillance technology, and recurring disasters. Well, it looks less like isolated chaos and more like a preview of how future societies may evolve under continuous emergency conditions. Again, tonight's goal is not to declare certainty where evidence does not exist, because they're great at fucking hiding it. Yeah, I'm a little testy tonight. But history is full of real conspiracies, corruption, negligence, profiteering, and institutional exploitation. It's also full of ordinary incompetence, natural disaster, and system collapsing under their own complexity. Sometimes the darkest outcomes emerge not from master plans, but from powerful incentives operating inside broken structures. But I doubt it. And perhaps that is the most uncomfortable possibility of all, maybe. Because if modernization increasingly rewards those who can profit from instability, then the future may not require secret orchestration at all. The system itself may naturally evolve toward perpetual crisis because crisis has become economically, politically, and technologically useful. I think it's mostly staged. Now, at the center of this entire investigation lies one unavoidable question. What exactly are we looking at? Are California's disasters simply the result of environmental pressure, aging infrastructure, political incompetence, and industrial complexity? Well, to those who have their heads in the sand, yeah. Or are the powerful interests here exploiting instability so consistently that the line between opportunism and coordination is beginning to disappear? I think it is. And this is the point where most conversations collapse into extremes. One side dismisses every suspicion as paranoia. The other side treats every fire, blackout, spill, and redevelopment project as proof of intentional orchestration. But reality is often more dangerous than either extreme because systems do not always require centralized conspiracy to produce outcomes that look coordinated. I agree. And sometimes incentives alone are enough. Start with negligence. California's infrastructure problems are not hidden. Utility companies deferred maintenance for years. They have. Because it costs more. While expanding services into increasingly dangerous terrain, and power lines stretch across dry forests, vulnerable to seasonal winds, water systems aged, rail infrastructure deterioration, housing expansion into fire-prone regions, emergency systems struggle to keep pace with population growth. And at the same time, state agencies faced political gridlock, environmental lawsuits, competing regulations, labor shortages, and ballooning costs. Well, in that environment, disaster becomes statistically inevitable. A single spark in dry conditions can ignite catastrophe. If you're driving drunk and smoking and you throw it out the window, no bueno. One failed transformer can destroy an entire town. You know that? One chemical leak can contaminate communities. One overwhelmed utility system can trigger rolling blackouts across millions of homes. Well, from this perspective, California does not require conspiracy to explain its instability. It requires only complexity, financial strain, deferred maintenance, and bad incentives. But now consider opportunism. History shows that institutions routinely benefit from crisis after they occur. Developers acquire distressed property. Technology firms secure modernization contracts. Governments expand authority during emergencies. Federal funding accelerates projects previously stalled for years. Investors with liquidity buy assets from financially devastated communities. Surveillance infrastructure expands under the language of safety and resilience. Well, none of this requires orchestration. Or orchestrating the original disaster. It only requires recognizing opportunity once chaos begins, which could be, and probably, I would say, I can't put a percentage on it, but I got to say the percentage is higher than lower, just naturally occurring. And that distinction matters because it changes how modern systems operate. A government may not intentionally cause a fire, but it may still use the aftermath to implement infrastructure agendas it already wanted. I mean, they could have hired someone to do it, but they didn't do it. A corporation may not engineer collapse, but it may profit enormously from reconstruction contracts afterward. A technology company may not desire disaster itself, but reoccurring emergencies create conditions where its systems become politically necessary. Well, this creates what could be called managed exploitation. Well, the crisis happens, the system adapts, the adaptation increases centralization, and the public gradually becomes more dependent on the institutions managing the recovery. Now comes the most hardest question of all. Can repeated opportunism eventually evolve into coordination? Well, that's where public suspicion begins deepening. Because when the same groups repeatedly benefit from instability, people naturally begin asking whether incentives eventually influence behavior before disasters occur. Not necessarily through direct sabotage, but through tolerance of risk, strategic neglect, regulatory manipulation, or allowing vulnerabilities to persist because crisis itself becomes economically useful. Well, this has happened throughout all of history. Banks took reckless risks before financial bailouts. Governments expanded surveillance after attacks. Corporations profited from wartime reconstruction. Industries ignored safety problems until catastrophe forced modernization. And sometimes systems drift toward disaster because the consequences become profitable to powerful actors afterward. Well, that possibility does not require secret meetings in dark rooms. It requires only human nature operating inside institutions built around money, survival, and power. And this is why California feels so psychologically unsettling to many Americans. The state appears trapped in a repeating cycle of disaster, federal aid, redevelopment, technological expansion, financial consolidation, and increased dependency. Well, each event strengthens the next layer of centralized infrastructure. Each emergency increases the argument for far more than monitoring, more automation, more digital management, and more top-down coordination. And over time, citizens begin wondering whether the system is trying truly trying to eliminate instability, or merely managing it profitably? Could be both, could be all of them. But to be fair, there's another explanation. Modern civilization may simply be too complex to govern without these technologies. California's leaders may genuinely believe smart infrastructure, AI systems, centralized utilities, and digital oversights are necessary to prevent future collapse. And it's their crazy brother-in-laws who are out there doing all this shit to help their brother. That's probably what's going on, right? Everyone's got one in the family. And from their perspective, every disaster proves the need for more coordination, not less. And perhaps, maybe that's true. Maybe. But the danger emerges when crisis itself becomes normalized, because societies living under permanent emergency gradually surrender things that they would never surrender during stable times. They surrender their privacy, local control, economic dependence, property security, freedom of movement, and resistance to centralized systems that therefore fear changes populations. And whether disasters are caused by incompetence, exploited through opportunism, or quietly shaped by deeper coordination, the outcome may still move in the same direction. A future where instability justifies increasing layers of technological and institutional control over everyday life. Well, that is why tonight's discussion matters, not because every suspicion is proven, not because every institution is evil, but because history repeats itself, and it warns that systems under pressure often evolve toward consolidation, and ordinary people usually realize what changed only after the transformation is already complete. So why insurance collapses? Why is it that an insurance company would just stop giving you insurance like days before a fire happens? How do they know this shit? If wildfire destruction was the first shock to California's system, the insurance crisis may become the second wave that permanently changed the state. Because after the flames disappear and the headlines fade, another reality quietly settles over entire communities. Many people can no longer afford to stay. Insurance is one of the hidden foundations of modern civilization, and most homeowners never think about it until it disappears. Mortgages depend on it. Rebuilding depends on it. Entire neighborhoods depend on the assumption that disaster can financially be absorbed through pooled risk. But California repeated mega fires may have begun breaking that model apart. Insurance companies are not charities. They operate on probability, risk exposure, and long-term financial survival. As fires intensified across California, insurers faced mounting losses running into tens of billions of dollars. Entire towns burned within hours, claims surged at historical levels, utility failures created enormous legal battles, and climate risk projections worsened. Reinsurance costs climbed globally. Eventually, many insurers began reaching the same conclusion. Some parts of California were becoming financially unmanageable. And once insurers retreat, the consequences spread rapidly. Homeowners suddenly face impossible premium increases or complete policy cancellations. And new buyers cannot secure affordable coverage. Property values begin weakening. Banks become more cautious about issuing loans in high-risk zones. Families already struggling with rebuilding costs face another devastating reality. Even if they rebuild, they may never be able to insure the property again at sustainable levels. And then it comes into the land, and then it comes into the infrastructures, and then it goes into, well, that California's risks are real. The fires are real. The insurance losses are real. The infrastructure challenges are real. It's all real. But it also is true that repeated crisis creates opportunities for ownership transformation. It does. Centralized planning. How convenient. And long-term redevelopment agendas that permanently alter the relationship between ordinary citizens and the land beneath their feet. Well, the deeper question may be whether modern disaster economics naturally evolve toward a future where fewer people can afford independence at all. Next comes the surveillance infrastructure and the new urban model. California now stands at the front edge of this transformation. The same state rebuilding after fires, blackouts, droughts, and chemical threat is also becoming one of the most technologically integrated regions in the entire world. Transportation systems increasingly depend on sensors and AI coordination. Utilities rely on digital monitoring. Public safety agencies integrate surveillance systems across jurisdictions and ports, automated logistics through massive data systems, and energy grids become interconnected, networks managed through real-time analytics. And environmental monitoring expands all across the water systems and air quality systems and wildfire zones. Well, individually, each system sounds reasonable, but together they create something much larger. A city capable of observing, predicting, and eventually managing every aspect of daily life. Well, from that perspective, smart infrastructure is not tyranny, it's adaptation. But critics ask a different question. They say, because every smart system collects data, every connected system expands overnight. Every centralized platform increases dependency, and every emergency accelerates public acceptance of systems that might once have been considered intrusive. It's going to happen. Well, this is where surveillance infrastructure quietly merges with disaster governments. And over time, a different kind of a city begins emerging. I mean, imagine a future where California is where utilities monitor energy usage in real time. They traffic systems movements continuously. AI will predict risk behavior before crimes occur, and environment systems monitor air and water constantly. Digital IDs will connect to transportation access, vehicle communications, and centralized traffic networks, and emergency systems can remotely influence energy distribution during crisis conditions. Now, none of this is science fiction anymore. Much of the infrastructure already exists in pieces. Older societies were built around physical control. Remember, roads, walls, checkpoints, visible authority. While modern systems increasingly operate through invisible management. Yeah. Algorithms, data collection, predictive analytics, automated permissions, digital access systems, behavioral monitoring. Yeah, that's all now. And the city itself becomes a living network capable of shaping behavior without any of overt force. And again, supporters would argue this framing is overly dark, and they're not wrong. But critics, they respond that dependence itself creates vulnerability, and I would agree. The more daily life becomes integrated into centralized digital systems, the easier it is to become for institutions to influence movement, communication, economic participation, and access to essential services. What could go wrong? Now, at some point, every society reaches a moment where it must decide whether it still controls its systems or whether its systems have begun controlling it. And California may be standing at that threshold. And perhaps that's the real story here tonight, folks. Not whether every institution is corrupt, but whether modern civilization itself has become structurally dependent on emergency. California may simply be the clearest example, modern example, because so many pressures collide there simultaneously through technology, debt, environmental stress, energy transition, housing instability, federal dependency, and surveillance infrastructure, all expanding together under the pressure of reoccurring risks. That's what it's doing. And whether that future emerges through incompetence, opportunism, necessity, or something far more coordinated, the result still will look remarkably similar. It will be a world rebuilt through crisis, governed through systems, and increasingly dependent on the institutions capable of managing permanent instability. And that is why tonight matters. Not because fear is the answer. Don't freak out. If you're a Christian, you'll be fine. But because discernment may be the last thing modern systems cannot automate. You think they can automate a Christian prophet? So to conclude, California may be the warning sign of something much larger than fires, blackouts, chemical spills, or failed infrastructure. It may be revealing what happens when a modern civilization reaches the point where crisis becomes permanent. A society under constant emergency no longer rebuilds the way older civilizations did. Yeah. It reconstructs itself through technology, data systems, centralized management, and economic consolidation. And every disaster becomes far more than destruction. It becomes an opening for transformation. And this investigation tonight, it walked through a difficult line because the truth rarely lives comfortably inside extremes. It would be irresponsible to declare that every fire is engineered or every chemical disaster is orchestrated without proof. That's where I am. But it would be equally irresponsible to ignore the patterns that continue repeating after every catastrophe. Federal money floating in, land ownership shifting, surveillance infrastructure expanding, smart systems replacing older systems, and ordinary citizens becoming increasingly dependent on institutions managing the recovery. You see, history teaches that crisis reshapes society. They do. It does. It's happening. And that is why the deeper question tonight was never simply, are disasters being used? The deeper question is, what kind of world is emerging because of them? I mean, I'm not the one doing it. They're doing it. And because the future rarely arrives all at once, it arrives layer by layer through moments of instability. A sensor here, a regulation there, a redevelopment project after one fire, a new emergency authority after the next. Slowly, the structure changes while the people remain focused only on surviving the latest crisis. Perhaps California is simply adapting to an unstable future, or perhaps modern systems have quietly learned that instability itself is useful. Maybe the answer is somewhere in between the two. But one thing that I know is becoming impossible to ignore is that every major disaster leaves behind a society that is more monitored, more centralized, more technologically dependent, and less connected to the independent world that existed before the emergency began. That does not mean fear is the answer. It means awareness matters, because civilization rarely loses freedom in a single moment. They surrender it piece by piece while trying to survive the fire that's in front of them, never realizing rebuilding process itself may be changing the foundations underneath their feet.
This has been Cause Before Symptom with your host, James Carner. Go to his website, jamescarner.com, and sign up for his newsletter. Also, download his free books on the breath war, the crown of blood, and the ritual machine. Fix your body by buying his award-winning detox formula, removing heavy metals and parasites. You'll feel better and live longer. Go to elitepotion.com. And one more thing, please. Just try and love your neighbor, because if you do, the world would be a better place. See you tomorrow.